So hello everyone. I really want to now read Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. 3 million copies sold. Wow, that's good. And it is called An Antidote for Chaos. And it seems the New York Times really evaluates Jordan B. Peterson to be the most influential public intellectual in the Western world right now. Now, why is that? Does he develop such revolutionary concepts? That may be questionable. I think it is more because he has gathered an army of meme-like supporters who really think that what he speaks to is the truth, and he's defending a culture that deteriorates, particularly in the West. And certainly in that regard, he's one of the most public intellectuals around the world. So what does Jordan Peterson talk about? I mean, we all know his lectures. Here we have another polarizing Rainbow Press video where Peterson completely destroys the feminist narrative. Now, Peterson himself sometimes says, well, in a sense of how I demand equality for the genders, I see myself as a feminist, but not the feminist nowadays. He actually fights for the rights of man, which is a controversial topic, but very famous is, for example, this interview.
Well, in what sense is our society male-dominated?
The fact that the vast majority of wealth is owned by men, the vast majority of capital is owned by men. Women do more unpaid labor.
Very tiny proportion of men, and a huge proportion of people who are seriously disaffected are men. Most people in prison are men. Most people who are on the street are men. Most victims of violent crime are men. Most people who commit suicide are men. Most people who die in wars are men. People who do worse in school are men. It's like, where's the dominance here precisely?
Well, the dominance here is probably that on the top only men reign. There are more and more exceptions, certainly, but in the centers of power, you will have a man in the end. I don't think he addresses that, but it's not my point to dive into this debate so much. But here we already have the front lines, right? He says, well, see, there are different hierarchies, and having hierarchies is not bad, as he will explain in the book later with regard to lobsters. He thinks hierarchy, as he also explains in this video, is necessary. But before we come to all of these positions, let's really dive into his book. And let's skip the forward. How do you say that in English, actually? Overture? I say it French, overture. So, and yeah, let's just see what Peterson writes. So he starts out here saying, well, you know, I wrote something on Quora, and my first responses that I gave on Quora were not very successful, but then I had the magic moment and I wrote a 99.9 percentile answer where I actually struck the right balance between the familiar and the unfamiliar while formulating rules for how somebody should live. And he says, well, maybe people don't respect rules anymore, like we are more and more against a rule-based society that maybe accepts something like natural hierarchies, which may also explain why he is against the dissolution of the distinction between two genders. And he wants to argue, well, there has to be a structure in order to fight something that is the chaos of being, right? It's a fine line between order and chaos. That's maybe how he would say. And in that regard, he wants to point out, well, listen, like our society gets something wrong. It's not just about happiness. So he's criticizing the idea of happiness, and he says there is an inevitable suffering that life entails, and we have to understand this in order to find the truth that we require a deeper meaning. Now, what is this deeper meaning? He says he already tried to reveal that in his book, more academic book, Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief. So it seems he says, well, belief is not just about what reality really is, but it's more about how we interact and create our identity. So this is certainly a more interesting position. He actually explains this a little bit more. So he goes here back to, I believe, the ancient places, and he says, well, look, these are descriptions, the stories in the Bible, for example. These stories are way more moral than descriptive. It's not about describing a world, it's more about the question of how people act. And then he writes, I suggested that our ancestors portrayed the world as a stage, a drama instead of a place of object. I described how I come to believe that the constituent elements of the world as drama were order and chaos and not material things. And so here we actually already get the underlying ontology of his project. He thinks the world comes basically in two shapes. Either it is ordered or it is chaos. And it seems he says, well, the desire for order may even drive us towards certain authoritarian structures. So we have to find the right balance between order and chaos. I think this is his overall goal, and somehow his rules are supposed to give orientation in this innate struggle of being alive and being related to whatever being is. And then he defines order is where people around you act according to well-understood social norms and remain predictable and cooperative. It's the world of social structure, explored territory, and familiarity. The state of order is typically portrayed symbolically, imaginatively as masculine. It's the wise king and tyrant forever bound together as society's simultaneous structure and oppression. So here's the extreme. I don't think that he entirely argues for this extreme order, because that would be authoritarianism, and we know quite well that he is against that. And he actually perceives the counter mechanism, which is symbolic, as feminine. And like two principle, it's kind of a binary system. And somehow we have to bring the masculine and the feminine into balance. And I think that at some point he doesn't only mean that symbolically, but I believe at some points he means that quite literally. So he goes on to explain what that means, and he describes order and chaos in the narrative of East Asian philosophies, or I guess more general Asian philosophies. And he says, well, order and chaos are the yang and yin, not the yin and yang, of the famous Taoist symbol. Two serpents had tail. Order is the white, masculine serpent. Chaos, the black, feminine counterpart. The black dot in the white and the white in the black indicate the possibility of transformation. Just when things seem secure, the unknown can loom unexpectedly and large. So yeah, we have here already a kind of simplified interpretation of what the Buddhist principle means. I find it interesting that he grasps it in terms of a binary system. I think a binary system is also limited to two sides, namely the question, well, maybe it's not binary, maybe it's one. I think Taoism meditates on that. So the two serpents are actually an abstraction of a larger whole. But it also borders on the idea that it's a tertiary system, or even has more components, which actually would dissolve the system overall. I would be very skeptical to grasp being in either one of these categories and see these ideas as symbolic expressions for understanding our place in the world. So this would here be just a very deep ontological criticism. But that somehow, it seems, the ontology on which he builds his whole, I would say, ideology. And let's go a little bit further now. So he now explains a bit further how he came to write the book, which does not have to interest us too much. But then he actually describes what beliefs are for him. And he says, I came to realize that shared belief systems made people intelligible to one another, and that the systems weren't just about belief, right? So it's not just about the belief, but the idea that we have beliefs brings us to the idea of cooperation. So whether we believe in a monotheistic God or polytheistic God does not matter then too much, because the underlying idea is that a shared belief system is just a kind of common surface with regard to which we can reliably act as a community. And then he says there's perhaps nothing more important than the maintenance of this organization, this simplification. So the belief system itself is a simplification, but we maintain it because otherwise we would descend into chaos, right? So they will fight instead to maintain the match between what they believe, what they expect, and what they desire. So in other words, a shared cultural system stabilizes human interaction, but is also a system of value. And then what we actually experience as valuable and as happiness is when goals of this system get fulfilled. And so he says, yeah, because there's always this threat that the system fails, we need to maintain it, but we also, I guess that's what he says, feel the possibility of meaninglessness. That would be something that Heidegger, especially with his existentialism, explores, and I think that's what he says here. But I mean, I think he says it in a more easier way. He says we must have something to set against the suffering that is intrinsic to being. So we want to adhere to the systems, because otherwise nihilism beckons with its hopelessness and despair. And we know Heidegger actually goes another direction. Heidegger says, well, you have to dive into that. You have to dive into that nihilism. You really have to embrace yourself in the meaninglessness of the society. But it seems Jordan Peterson rather says, no. We need to stick to society because we have to lose more than, as Arnold Gehlen would say, just our chains. So in this sense, he says, if we have no value system, then we have no meaning. Completely different from a existentialism that Heidegger would defend, right? Then, however, the next problem that he encounters now is that between different value systems that arise in different cultures, there's a possibility of conflict. And then we even get into the conflict of nuclear powers. And he says, well, do we really want that, right? He says we can no longer afford that kind of conflict, but we cannot simply abandon our system of value or beliefs or cultures either. And now he says, well, how do I deal with this? How do I deal with this struggle, right? And he actually dreams, yeah. And he has now a dream where he flies over a church and sees himself crucified. So we like a bit like Dilthey's dream of how he actually solves. Dilthey actually at that moment had a very similar conflict, and he was dreaming, well, how do we protect our society from ascending into chaos while we don't have an absolute belief system at the same time? So what does he dream? So dreams shed light on the dim places where reason itself has yet to voyage, to travel. How do you say that in English? Voyage? That's a very interesting way of saying that. So, and he says, okay, now I dream, and he flies over a church, as I understand him, and now he reflects on what is the symbolic meaning of the church. The church is constructed like a cross, and in the middle of the so-called ship, there's the moment of suffering and transformation. So he tries to get out of that dream, and he says, I managed to get down out of the heights, out of the symbolic sky, back to safe, familiar, anonymous ground. I don't know how, and I don't know how, right? So a great wind was dissolving me, preparing to propel me back to the cathedral. So he dreams again, and to place me once again at the central point. There was no escape. It was a true nightmare, right? I forced myself awake. So, but I mean, now he reflects on that and he says, well, my dream placed me at the center of being itself, and there was no escape. I'm a big fan of interpreting religious writings existentially, which he does here, or let's call it deep psychologically. So there's also a very interesting book from Eugen Drewermann who does it in a very similar way. I recommend that very much. I don't know if there exists a translation, so I just translated. It's called Deep Psychology and Exegesis, where basically Drewermann in 2 volumes reconstructs the Bible from a deep psychological viewpoint without deifying God, means turning God into a thing. So he tries to understand it from a more energetic level where God is an energy deeply placed inside of us. I think this is also kind of what Peterson does. So it is definitely a more advanced standpoint that is not just simply saying we have to revert to theology to have a stable system. He says, well, we have to take theology seriously for what it expresses about human beings. But the question to me is, does he really get down to the existential meaning of what theology means? And I think the binary system that he proposes is deeply problematic as an underlying ontology. But maybe we will discuss about that more with regard to the 12 rules. So he says further, the center of the church is occupied by the individual. We have Jesus right in the cross section of the church, and there's the cross of Jesus, the suffering. And Jesus is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit exemplified by one individual that dies. Right? So he gives it a really deep existential meaning, which I have to say again, I appreciate that, right? So existence at that cross is suffering and transformation, and the fact above all needs to be voluntarily accepted. So now he comes to the dilemma, because now as the individual, we seek more authoritarian structures, though we do not seek authoritarianism. We also seek freedom. We seek kind of both. We need a stable background, a stable, let's say, family or state that allows us to be free, right? And he says, how could the world be freed from the terrible dilemma of conflict on the one hand and psychological and social dissolution on the other? The answer was this. I tried to read it in the voice of Peterson, but I can't. So, through the elevation and development of the individual and through the willingness of everyone to shoulder the burden of being and to take the heroic path, we must each adopt as much responsibility as possible for individual life, society, and the world. So his solution is basically liberalism, right? So he says, well, the way we can solve the dilemma is liberalism. A state where individuals take over more responsibility will be a good state. Well, I will not comment on that here. This is a larger discussion about, for example, liberalism and communitarianism and so on and so forth. And it would be kind of unfair because the text does not give enough resources here so that it can defend itself with regard to that. But I think we can mark here, this indicates that Peterson is a liberal in the sense of liberty rights. Okay. So, and again, he speaks here about the alternative, the horror of authoritarian belief, the chaos of collapsed state, the tragic catastrophe. So these are different options, right? The tragic catastrophe of unbridled natural world, the existential angst and weakness of the purposeless individual. By the way, again, this here, the last part, this would be where Heidegger says, yeah, man, you need to go there, right? You shouldn't say, like, we should escape that. Because you have to figure out that your society, even your libertarian society, with this kind of freedom is ultimately meaningless, right? This is, for example, what Zizek says in a very smart way. He says, capitalism basically sells you the illusion of freedom. For example, you can choose between 20 different sorts of cheese, and you experience that of freedom. But you're not free. You're still captured in a system where you have to choose between cheese options. Completely, you're immersed in that ideology, right? You're not allowed to go outside of the state. Well, a libertarian would say, well, yeah, but you need to be allowed to. So I should not dive here into this discussion because the text does not give the resources to address that. But I think when we look at the debate between Jordan Peterson and Zizek, we see quite clearly that Jordan B. Peterson doesn't even understand this kind of problem. So I think that's why the debate was hopelessly lost by him against Zizek. And I always wonder, like, how can people say that it was equal? I really wonder. I don't see it, but yeah, it seems there's a large theoretical gap. Like, many people think, oh yeah, it must be about the conflict between men and women, and obviously there are a lot of things that vibe with me when Peterson defends man's rights, right? But the further step to see where's this ideology, almost nobody takes. So it indicates clearly. So now he speaks about the ordering principles that we need, right? Which is kind of authoritarian, even though he speaks against authoritarian principles. So here we certainly have a tension in the systems. So we require rules, standards, values alone and together. And Heidegger would say, well, now you need to find them in an authentic way. And what does Peterson say? Well, clean up your room, I guess. So we require routine and tradition. That's a justification for tradition, really? So, for example, if it's traditional, let's say that we, I try to find something horrible, but let's say that the man has the right to decide whether there's a divorce or not. It's tradition and a routine. That would not be justified, right? I guess Peterson would also say, yeah, that's not justified. But we have to say here clearly, okay, what do we want about tradition, right? Obviously, I think most of the time we don't want tradition, we want what is right. So we don't want to have tradition. But maybe tradition transports better what is right. But still then we want what is the right thing to do. But yeah, it seems here he says, oh, that's order. But then again, he runs into the conflict. Order can become excessive. Order can become excessive and it's bloody hell. That's not good. Okay, I need to work on my Peterson impersonation. So here, this is the dividing line between order and chaos, right? That's where we are stable enough. Okay, so he wants like to have this dividing line. And that's probably what the book is about, right? It tries to avoid the pathway to hell, as he says it, and bloody pathways to hell, right? And he wants to somehow save the individual. But yeah, I mean, what do we further talk about that? I mean, Marx also wanted that, Nietzsche wanted that, Hegel wanted that, Hitler was responding, or maybe not Hitler, he was too dumb, but National Socialism was responding to that, also in the early forms of Heidegger. So I think we need some historical awareness of this problem, which he does not show here. He just says like, okay, I don't study the tradition. I just see there were historical problems in the totalitarianisms of Stalin and of Nazi ideology, and here's an alternative. But there were many traditional concepts and philosophies who have already way deeper thought through this problem. So why not also diving into these philosophies and studying them? As, for example, Zizek does. And I think Zizek develops a way deeper model of that addresses these problems. Yeah. So how can we summarize that so far? Jordan Peterson, I think we see here, I don't know what this picture means, by the way. So we have here fighting lobsters. I don't understand that. The lobsters are a central element of his theory because he says, okay, this kind of game of hormones, particularly of serotonin, has survived over 350 million years and is still working in us, and therefore straighten up, show your muscles to the world, give yourself the serotonin push, and then become the strong lobster. Right? And maybe this is what the boy does, right? The boy is like cheeky and the girl is more feminine. Is she the chaos? Is he the order? What does this picture tell me? I don't know. Maybe you help me. Maybe you help me. Okay, so this was what I wanted to say about Jordan Peterson so far, about the introduction. What do you think about that? Was that helpful? Do you think I overlooked something so far? Did I get the ideology? Did I carve it out correctly? Or do you say, no, that's not what Jordan Peterson says, right? Is my impersonation really bad? Probably it is, but like watching a lot of Jordan B. Peterson, you cannot avoid to start hearing his voice in your head, right? Yeah, so I hope you liked the video. Give it a thumbs up, and maybe you even subscribe to the channel if you like it. Hit the bell, play the capitalist game with me, and yeah, share your social media love. Bye bye, and be a lobster. Be a lobster.